Hello, and welcome to another episode of Expert Talks, the video podcast series presented by InnoVint, where we chat with wine professionals who are experts on everything you need to know on how to run a healthy, successful wine business. I am your host, Lauren Heindel, and I am joined today by Jim Duane, host of the Inside Winemaking podcast and the winemaker at Seavey. Welcome, Jim.
Lauren, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here and talk about winemaking stuff today.
Well, I'm excited to have you here as well. You have a long history in the wine industry, and your podcast, Inside Winemaking, has become a go-to resource for many aspiring and seasoned winemakers alike. Can you start by telling us a little bit about your journey and kind of how you got into winemaking and what led you to ultimately starting a podcast?
Sure, you bet. So I grew up, like so many people that come into the wine industry, I grew up outside of any wine region. I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah,
Hmm.
and actually started making beer when I was in high school because it was basically the only way to get beer in high school in Salt Lake City in the late 90s. And kind of from that started following, I was just so enchanted and so entranced by the winemaking process. It seemed magical to me. Today, it still seems magical to me after learning it for all these years. But I kind of quickly graduated onto wine kits, and I enjoyed that. I love the fermentation, but I've always been a real plant nerd. I've always been someone who knew that like I needed to work outside on my feet and with plants. And so once I kind of figured out that I could put those two together, the fermentation and agriculture, and be on my feet, working with my hands, I just realized that was the only thing I ever wanted to do. Um, Having said that, like the only wine I'd ever had to that point was the wine that I made. So I had to go and learn what wine was actually supposed to taste like and how to make great wine.
Yes.
Um, but I was very fortunate in that I started early. So I went to college, and then after college, went to work in New Zealand for a year, knowing that I wanted to come back to go to grad school. I ended up going to UC Davis to get a master's degree. But again, sitting in a chair and doing schooling was something it was just too much for me to go straight to grad school. So going to work in New Zealand, it was great to be 22 and go play and work. And that kind of cemented my love, my desire to make wine. So I went to
Mhm.
UC Davis for a couple of years, and then I've been in Napa since 2004, working at various wineries. I live and I'm based in Napa Valley and make some wines throughout the state and help some people outside of California now. But the base of my work and my work at Seavey Vineyard here is really kind of specific to Napa Valley.
Nice. Yeah, you mentioned that you've been at CV for almost 15 years, correct?
That's right.
Wow. So, CV, it's a small family-owned winery, for those of you who don't know. And what would you say have been some of the most valuable lessons you've learned while kind of managing the winery production side of a small winery?
Yeah. So first of all, when you say managing, it's kind of funny because I work alone, so I'm somewhat self-managing.
Okay.
CV is a really cool place because it's an estate. So we have our vineyards that we produce our wine from here on the same physical property. So it's a 200-acre ranch, about 40 acres planted to grapevines. We farm with our own in-house team, and to me, it was a big shift. I was working at larger wineries before coming to Seavey Vineyard, kind of in a desk job, like big enough that I was writing work orders, handing those off to a cellar master, was overseeing the winery. I had some, on the run up to harvest, I would go out to vineyards to sample vineyards, but I felt kind of disconnected from vineyards. And then
Hmm.
that all changed in coming to Seavey Vineyard, where everything is here on this site. We're up in Con Valley, which is the eastern part of St. Helena, so kind of northeastern part of St. Helena in the Vaca Range. And I wouldn't say that I had to unlearn big winemaking, but I had to ultimately I learned to shift my thinking and actually do a lot less work in my winemaking now at this smaller winery than I would do at a larger winery. Perhaps because there's less risk, but also I'm just more intimately tied to a smaller volume of wine, so I can really stay on top of stuff. And it allows me to take more risk, I think, and through fermentation and just through all of winemaking. And ultimately, it's my hope that leads to more expressive wines that really show the site, really show the grape, and I'm kind of trying to peel back the layers of protection, things like filtering and some of the other sort of hands-on winemaking that might be more important and more appropriate in a larger winery.
Yeah, that point that you made on unlearning big winery protocols, I very much relate to that. I've worked in large facilities that run 24/7, and
Oh, that's
then
big.
yes, and then some smaller wineries as well. And the larger winery was Matua out in New Zealand as well. Um, there's a lot of busy work associated with making the wine. And you get disconnected from the day to day, like what does it actually smell like? What is the goal that I'm trying to achieve with this specific wine? Where did the grapes come from? How is that transferring into the bottle? And you just hit the nail on the head with the large winemaking is all of these like onion layers that you have to peel back and like get back down to the core. So I love that sentiment. And then you mentioned to me another time you work with a lot of first time and new winemakers,
Sure.
either with your consulting or with like introductory to your podcast. What are some of the most common mistakes you see or the most common challenges that they come to you with?
It's kind of funny because I have a couple of daughters, and my eldest daughter's now 15, and she just got into tennis in this past year. And just
Wow.
went from, Dad, hey, I want to start learning tennis, to now she's really into it. But the first things that she wanted to run out and do were to buy the shoes, to buy the racket, to sort of get all the equipment. And I see a real parallel when people get into winemaking. Um, I think there's a great need to learn winemaking, and that's not always easy to do. That's one of the reasons I started the podcast, and it's one of the goals is for the podcast to be a resource for technical winemaking. But I think a lot of people rush out and get equipment. Um, and
Ah,
one of the things I do in helping people is try and like strip that down a little bit, because you can always buy more equipment. But when you're starting, I think I mean, there's so many easy ways and fast ways to spend a lot of money with winemaking equipment, with grapes themselves. So I really try
yes.
and temper people to try to focus on grapes and great clean winemaking, especially at the beginning. And then as needed, we can graduate and get to some of the fancier, the more high price tag pieces of equipment. But I think in the beginning, because most people do make a lot of mistakes, and unfortunately, a lot of people, including myself, when I first started, have to roll the barrel out to the front and dump the wine down the drain because it's not salvageable. Want to keep those mistakes cheap in the beginning, and
Ah,
so I try and really help people understand what are the sort of bare bones, most important pieces of equipment, both in the winery. I don't know if you could see behind me here this is my office, but also the lab. I have some pretty
yeah.
basic lab equipment, but I want to make sure people are smart with their dollars, and as their skills progress, then the spend can progress.
Yeah. I love how you started with the tennis analogy because I felt a little called out. I also got into pickleball and got a really nice paddle, and now it's been probably a year and a half since I've played. So, um, great analogy. Let's talk about another thing that a lot of new and seasoned winemakers have to deal with, and that is around wine faults. It's one of the biggest challenges that winemakers face, no matter the size of the winery. Can you walk us through a few of the common wine faults? We can go from TCA and some other ones down the line. How do you start detecting it? How do you look for it? And then what do you do once you found it? What are your steps if you've gone through that?
Sure. And Lauren, maybe we'll put TCA on the back burner and come around back to that, but I'll start with some of
Sure.
the other faults that I think. So a lot of faults derive from and during fermentation. Things like reduction can come from underfeeding nitrogen to yeast. Things like oxygen can come from having too much headspace, too much oxygen in contact with the wine, not necessarily during fermentation, but shortly after fermentation. You can only have this short window of time when wine is really protected from oxygen when it's actively fermenting. And so I see a lot of it's very easy to get into things like oxidation. That's probably one of the main faults that I see. And part of that is also understanding how and when to work with sulfur, SO2.
Hmm.
because that can be protective against oxygen. Bisulfite can also scavenge acetaldehyde and make it so that you're not smelling that oxidative, rotten apple type smell. Um, let's see what else. So we got, and then VA, volatile acidity. That's an interesting one because all wines have some volatile acidity, mostly in the form of acetic acid. And so it's not
Hmm.
necessarily bad, but when the concentrations get high, when they get out of control, then you kind of enter a territory where maybe things, you can start calling it a fault. So that's an interesting
Hmm.
one because you can't get rid of volatile acidity. You just need to manage it and control it so it doesn't get out of whack and you end up with vinegar.
Yeah.
Um,
And you do that with managing your SO2, right? So
that's part of it.
part of it. Yeah. Can
So
you
yeah,
elaborate?
managing SO2, and really, if you think the majority of volatility comes from bacteria, not from yeast. And so that's, kind of the main reason why winemakers might add SO2 at the before fermentation, especially if they're going to have like a cold soak period. You want to give
Hmm.
the yeast a chance, especially Saccharomyces, a chance to build the populations for fermentation. But you don't really want bacteria running out in front of the yeast and building their populations. Also, at the end of fermentation, after you have the protective effect of the yeast in fermentation, you may need bacteria, especially malolactic bacteria, to do your secondary malolactic fermentation. But you don't want other problematic bacteria running away and creating volatile acidity, and they're especially stimulated by oxygen. So if you have a barrel that's partial or a tank with an open top and you can't protect the wine from oxygen, then you can start stimulating bacteria to create volatile acidity. And there's that sort of window of malolactic fermentation where you can't add SO2 because you don't want
Hmm.
to inhibit the bacteria that you want to do that fermentation. So you have to wait till they finish and all the malic is converted to lactic acid. But then pretty quickly thereafter, you do want to protect with some, or if you're choosing to use SO2, because more and more people are trying to not use SO2, and that's, I hate to say it, but it's also part of winemaking, especially for the natural winemaking crowd. Um,
Hmm.
but knowing when to use it and to protect your wine can be really helpful, and that's one of the probably the most direct ways to manage your volatile acidity from getting too high.
Okay. That's a really great breakdown. Might be a sidebar, but I'm interested in your point of view on how sulfur is produced as a byproduct during fermentation, and so therefore is technically in every single wine. So how do organic wines or certain wines market themselves as sulfur-free or no sulfur added? How does that work?
Yeah, this is a complex one and it's kind of interesting. So it is true that yeast will produce some SO2 during fermentation, although it's really small quantities. So I get a little bit cranky when people say like, "Oh, all wines have SO2 because it's a natural product of fermentation." It
Okay.
is, however, it's on such a small level, and I know this because I watch it with my own fermentations. I'm measuring the free SO2 and the total SO2. After fermentation with a red wine, it's zero. There's zero. Like I'm not getting, maybe there was some created by the yeast, but then it's also bound up or
Hmm.
somehow eliminated. Where you will see some SO2 is in white wines. And I think that's maybe because you don't have all the skins and seeds, all the physical material, all the phenolic material that might bind up some of that SO2. I will see white wines that come out of fermentation with some total SO2. However,
Okay.
rarely do I see any white wine or rosé come out with any free SO2 because that just
Ah,
all gets bound up pretty quick. So is it there? Is it natural? Yes. White wines. Is it there for red wines? Like, no, from what I'm measuring, no. Maybe there's other circumstances. And so I just think, and going back to like organics. So if you're making wine from organically farmed grapes, which is what most people are making when they're referring to organic wines, you have an upper limit of total SO2 at 100 ppm, which is not that
oh,
hard to do. Most good winemaking should be, below that anyway. So
yeah.
organic wines or wines made from organic grapes can use SO2. Um, just, they're limited. And then for natural winemakers who don't want to use any SO2, I just find that that which is naturally produced by the yeast it's not enough to protect your wine. So often those wines are oxidized, have VA issues, start to smell and taste like kombucha.
Yeah. Which can be an acquired taste, and can be
I mean,
done
I'm
well.
still trying to acquire it. I'm having trouble, but some people like it apparently.
Oh, that's a good one. Well, what about Brett? Is I know Brettanomyces, did I say that right? I know there's a
Yep,
couple ways it's floated around. Great. Brettanomyces is sometimes considered a wine fault, and some winemakers, specifically in Europe, embrace its influence. Where do you stand on this, and where have you managed it in your winery so far?
sure. I kind of almost live in two camps on this because I don't want Brettanomyces in my winery. And for all the
Hmm.
people that I work with, I'm really trying to help them either avoid or control Brettanomyces in their own wineries because I'm working with American winemakers. However, the wines I like to drink and buy and drink from Bordeaux and from parts of Italy often have a little bit of Brettanomyces character in the wines, and I like that. Like, it's one of the reasons I seek that out.
Mm.
I think, especially in a case like Bordeaux, when you have wines that are, to play a compare and contrast Bordeaux to California, Bordelais wines tend to be more savory, and the flavors and the aromas of Brettanomyces, I think, work much more seamlessly with those wines than some of the more fruit-forward wines we make in America, especially California, where we have a lot of sunshine, get a lot of fruit flavors. I think those flavors don't mesh as well. But to your question, so Brettanomyces is a genus of yeast. It's co-evolved essentially with wine, so it's really well suited to a wine environment. And so it can handle wine pH, it can handle some free SO2, it can handle alcohol, 13, even 14%, it can do fine. I have seen that once you get into like high levels of alcohol, 15% and above, Brettanomyces really doesn't survive quite well.
Mm.
Um, but
Okay.
Britannomyces is an interesting one because it's not a problem that develops during fermentation, like some of the other faults that we discussed, like oxidation and reduction and VA, things like that. You tend to see Brettanomyces in red wines after, I mean, I've never seen it before 6 months of wine being in barrel. And the longer
Huh.
a wine's in barrel, the more likely you are to see it. And
Mm.
you're only going, by see it, I mean smell it.
Smell it.
Smelling
Yeah.
those things like Band-Aid, Sweaty Horse, the compounds that we measure to sort of quantify it, the proxy molecules are 4-ethyl phenol and 4-ethyl guaiacol, kind of smoky, Band-Aidy proxy molecules. Okay, tell me again, what was your question? I kind of got lost, but what do you want to talk about with Brettanomyces? I've had some experience, so I'm happy to talk
Yeah.
about it.
Well, you answered where do you stand on this? You're in two camps. You don't like to make it, you like to drink it. And I think I can relate to that a bit. So when you're working with an American winemaker and you are, topping barrels and you say, "Oh, these three smell a little Band-Aidy." What do you do in that
Yeah.
situation?
First of all, freak out because it's a real problem, especially if you don't want Brettanomyces, and it's not easy, quick, or cheap to solve these problems. You can solve the problem and you can eliminate Brettanomyces from your wines. It's maybe more hard to completely eliminate it from your winery, but you can try. But the
Hmm.
most important thing that a producer can do that I found is to turn the cellar temperature down. If you can
Ah.
get the cellar temperature down to about 52 degrees, and unfortunately, not everyone can do that, and it's expensive, but that'll really hold the sort of the metabolism, the action of Brettanomyces itself. So you're not eliminating the infection, you're not eliminating the cells that are in the wine, but you can hold the infection from producing those aromas. So that's the most simple thing. Uh, get your temperature down, and I learned some of this from oh, there's a professor of microbiology up at Washington State, Charlie, oh, forgetting his last name. It'll come to me in a minute, but he was
Okay.
really helped me with understanding this, and he told me like 52 degrees, and in my experience, that was true. So that's a great start. So like you smell Brett, get that cellar temperature down. Then bumping up free SO2s help. Go kind of on the higher range of what you're comfortable with to try and inhibit to some degree Brettanomyces. And then what you really have to do is you've got to filter your wines. You have to remove the cells from your wine to stop the
Mm.
infection. Um,
So is that a very fine filter you need to use?
I mean, generally, if you can filter down to 1 micron, you're going to eliminate almost all of the
Okay.
problems. And it's difficult because this is an infection you see in barrel, and oak barrels are kind of inherently unsanitizable. I think
Yeah.
steam is the best sanitizing agent for barrels. Not everyone has that, but imagine you have an infected wine, you rack it out to tank, you filter the wine. Well, you may still have to go back to barrel. It may not be ready for bottling. You may need the oak, and
Yeah.
so you're almost compromised in having to take your wine back to barrel. You've got all the money in the world. You can bring in new barrels, but that's pretty rare. But if you can steam barrels, that's pretty good. But once you have an infection, then it's constant monitoring. It's keeping your temperatures low, keeping your free SO2s high. You can add, but then free SO2 is going to drift down over time. Just make sure you don't drift too low, and then sort of quarantine and segregating any lots that have infections. You can send samples out to, like, ETS is the lab where they can run what's called scorpions, which is a
Mhm.
PCR, a quantitative PCR test that'll tell you how many cells of Brettanomyces you have, if you have them, and how many cells. And so if you have a bunch of wines and some are suspect, you may send samples out to understand where the infection is. But then, quarantine is a big part of a prevention strategy.
Well, that's it for this episode of Expert Talks. Stay tuned for part 2 with Jim Duane as we dive deeper into more common wine faults and managing small winery resources for an estate. Until next time, cheers.